Welcome to week 4, conducting and writing a literature review. This week we tackle 2 chapters, chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 really is all about the lit review, setting you up for it, how it should be organized, how you want to gather the resources around your questions and so forth. Those of you in the MED program, again, we are really looking at this in terms of how I can gather some sufficient information and more of a professional review, which is talked about in that chapter. Those of you in the MS are really going to be doing formal literature reviews, so I suggest you folks in the MS read the entire chapter. But for this course, because it's primarily designed for the MED students, pages 53 through 62 are sufficient. Pages after that get into a lot more detail that are really applicable to a formal literature review. That will be chapter 2 in the research thesis for those of you doing that. I also ask you to read pages 71 through 75. That is an interesting little vignette, a little article that they use to demonstrate lit reviews on homework. So I think you'll find that one interesting, and so that's what I want you to read in chapter 3. Chapter 4, I've asked you to skim. Read the example on page 104, and that's really at the very end of the chapter, because my lecture this week is going to really cover the content of that chapter in terms of search engines and citation managers. So just skim through the main headings, maybe pull out a few things that look, that sounds interesting, look at the vocabulary and so forth, but you don't need as close a read on chapter 4 as you really need on chapter 3. Our objectives this week are to explain how literature reviews develop a knowledge base and can bring understanding to educational problems. And when we look at the practical questions at the beginning of the chapters, that becomes even more clear. And then 2, to develop some basic skills to conduct a review of the literature on a specific educational topic. And that really is all about practicing using the search engines. From this point forward in the course, whenever I have a paper that I want you to read that is not inside of your text, that's somewhere that's out on the web, and it may be in one of the databases that we're going to discuss, I will just give you the citation. I'm not going to give you the direct link. I want you to be able to practice finding articles that you know the title or in some cases the author, and I will give you the whole citation. But just to get familiar with how to grab that kind of content from the web and from these online databases is something I want you to do. So don't be surprised when, where's the link? Why didn't she provide the PDF? It's on purpose. They will be online and you will be able to find them, and if not, you'll send me a note and everybody will send me a note. But I always test those things before I send them on to you. In terms of videos, I'm making the one that's going to be plopping in right here. And then this USU library guide to Google Scholar. This will show you how to link your USU credentials with Google Scholar. It gives you some more functionality inside of Google Scholar, which I'll explain in just a moment. This is a fairly short video made by the USU library, and I highly recommend that you watch this and associate your USU credentials. You know, you pay fees at this university to use the library along with your credits and so forth. So use these resources. These databases are paid for out of student fees, and so access them. If you don't use those, you'll run across articles that say, this article costs 25 bucks, 40 bucks. I've seen articles cost as much as $20. But as soon as you log in or look at that article in the database that USU has paid a subscription fee to, it's free. So you may run into a couple of those in the course as we move through and I say go find this article. If you don't log in, you'll be like, wait, it says it's $25. Not really. You just need to find it through a different venue. And that's part of the practice that I'm talking about for chapter 4, how to hunt down and research and dig in. And sometimes when these searches happen, you find yourself distracted. You end up going down a rabbit hole of something that's interesting, and you go, wait a minute, I'm not supposed to be looking for that. And you'll come back out and find what you're looking for. Just like when you're surfing the web, you have all experienced how you get like, how did I get here? That's a little bit about how these databases and Scholar article or Google Scholar work. Of course, you'll have the discussion questions and then the quiz for chapters 3 and 4. And if you haven't noticed already, the quiz is really, they're open note. I just want you to be really familiar with the vocabulary. If you understand the vocabulary in research, it's so much easier when you're reading something or somebody comes to you with research says, and you understand the word for how that research was conducted. It just makes it so much easier. And also, you'll be able to spot something that's quite honestly not true, or it's something like maybe when you go to the mechanic and they tell you something that's wrong with your car that doesn't even exist, like your piston springs are bad. You know that your car doesn't have piston springs. for you to say, whoa, I really got to have those replaced. Same thing in research. If somebody is giving you something that's like completely not accurate, or that's not the way a research study would be conducted, could be considered valid. That's the sort of thing that you'll be able to do by knowing the vocabulary, and that's why I put it in these quizzes. All right, I have a couple things I want to highlight first, and then we'll get back to the online resources from chapters 3 and 4. The problems of practice in chapter 3, they always grab these kind of headline kinds of things that are going through education. You folks could actually create these bullets, but the first item that they put down that's important, that would be useful with a literature review, is about cyberbullying. Is it really a serious problem? And quite honestly, there's been a ton of research on cyberbullying. When I Googled it in Scholar, there were tons of articles about it. What features must a professional development school have in order to be effective? And that's really talking about teacher preparation. There's a lot of research out there that says what does and doesn't work, at least in certain populations. Do some students benefit from computer-based learning environments more than others, which is a really important question today as we move towards flipped and blended classrooms. Does that really impact student achievement? Does it work for all students, and so forth? Is the method of instruction known as cooperative learning actually effective? Now, cooperative learning has been around since the late 70s. And so there's quite a large body about cooperative learning, and in fact, a lot of teaching strategies about cooperative learning, where we don't always call it that, but there's different ways to engage folks in a discussion, whether they're small group, a fishbowl discussion, a jigsaw discussion. Some of these terms may be meaningful to some of you if you've used these techniques. If not, hopefully you covered those in another course, the assessment and evaluation course. When I taught that, at least I taught some of those different teaching strategies. But cooperative learning has a very large body of research because it's been researched for, 30 or so years. Should teachers assign homework? And that's actually the last little vignette that I asked you to read this week in that chapter. And there's some studies that they pull out, and you'll maybe be surprised, maybe not. Is the process writing approach actually effective in improving student writing skills? This was actually one of the articles also at the end of the chapter. It's a longer article on meta-analyses, and we're going to talk about meta-analyses in more detail in chapter 8, so I'm holding on that. I may find a better article related to career and technical education. I've identified a few. I need to go through them a little bit more. But we will come back and talk about meta-analyses at the end of this, during chapter 8, I believe it is. So problems of practice in chapter 4. Are charter schools more effective than regular and public schools? Now, you all probably have an opinion. You can make a claim, but what's the evidence? And so that's how, in this case, this is all about search engines and how to find articles on this topic about charter schools and effectiveness. What can be done to help disadvantaged students graduate from high school and enroll in college? What can be done to help students who are aggressive or antisocial? How can mathematics be taught using online instruction? And is it beneficial to give students tangible rewards for good grades? I'm very interested in this particular topic because I see it happen all the time, especially in the elementary grade levels. And then we have a conversation about intrinsic and extrinsic rewards and those kinds of things. This is a really fascinating area I think, to study, because I see it so often in schools being used to hopefully change behavior, including getting better grades and so forth. All of the things that they present here, I think, resonate with you in a different way depending on your experience. But you can see that using a search engine and conducting a review of the literature hopefully gives you some answers. And if some questions aren't answered, that's the point of continuing research. That is the kind of problems that you're looking to solve by doing research. All right, so important ideas. And of course, the important ideas are targeted in the quiz. The important ideas that are part of each of those chapters, I grab those, but I also really, as I mentioned, take a close look at vocabulary. Vocabulary is extremely important. It will serve you well as you move through this course and you read research and you confront research that's presented in your teaching situation where folks say, research says. I always love that, research says. You might say, yeah, but where's that study? Let me look at it. I hope to create more critical thinkers as a result of this course. One of the words, or the terms rather, is effect size. We're going to spend a little bit of time But we have a huge chapter on practical significance and statistical significance in week 8. So I'm going to briefly hit it because I talk about it here related to the literature reviews that you do. But we are going to come back and revisit it. It's real important in education. So we will double dip on this. It is related to how you conduct meta-analysis. That's another term. It's part of the vocabulary. You're going to see it between now and chapter 8 when we really dig into those two terms in more detail. They're introduced in this chapter, chapter 3. Primary and secondary sources, this should be familiar to you. Probably in your undergraduate, talked about primary and secondary sources. There's a quiz question on it. Formal and professional literature review, I mentioned that just a moment ago. Formal definitely is something that is required in your MS degree. And of course, a professional literature review, which I see in a lot of the ASCD publications that I receive, that authors write. They're basically almost, secondary sources. They're professional reviews. They're done in a way that there's not a lot of jargon, that most people can understand what is being said, and they explain things like effect size in enough detail that folks can understand what's being talked about. This is the kind of review that I'm going to see hopefully in your final project, more of a professional literature review. You also see these oftentimes in professional trade magazines and so forth, just a more brief type of review. And then, of course, we'll talk about search engines, and I'm going to show you a little bit about how those work. So let's talk a moment about practical or statistical significance, which you may have seen as p-values. Those of you who've taken any kind of stats, and some of you I know have gone through those in your graduate program already, and practical significance, effect size, because they mention it again in this chapter. So sometimes you'll hear somebody say it's statistically significant at a p of 0.05. Less than, that means that there's a small chance that it would have occurred naturally without that particular intervention or whatever that study was trying to do. So statistical significance and practical significance are not the same thing. Statistical significance is really about the numbers, and practical significance suggests that, hey, well, while it's statistically significant, is it practically significant for us to make changes? And let me see if I can explain that in a little more detail here. So the effect size is the main finding in a quantitative study. While the p-value can inform the reader about whether the effect exists, the p-value will not reveal the size of the effect. So for example, I mentioned my dissertation project a week or so ago, and I found statistical significance of improvement on their pre and post, that they did a pre and post survey on their career knowledge and career self-efficacy. But statistically, it was significant in a population like I had, which was over 6,000 students. It's actually fairly easy. When you start to get very large populations, it's very often true that you will be getting a statistically significant statistic. And so you then put it into an effect size calculator to say, well, it's statistically significant, but does it mean that things should change? So I have found a statistically significant value that students' scores had increased in knowledge about the 8 pathways. But when I took a closer look and ran the effect size, I found out that yes, it was statistically significant, but they only had a 1-point gain on a 10-point scale. So you say to yourself, is a 1 point, or and in this case it was 1.4, almost 1.5 point gain on a 10-point scale, 5-point scale, is that enough for us to say, wow, this is really effective? Is it worth spending $1 million on? Wouldn't we expect to see a much greater gain? And so that's the part of interpretation that you're going to do in a discussion, and that's why you calculate the effect size, especially in educational research where we're dealing with public money. We find something statistically significant, but is it practical? Does it make sense for us to make a change? In reporting and interpreting studies, both the substantive significance, the effect size, which I just discussed, and the statistical significance p-value are essential. They both need to be reported. Because during a meta-analysis, somebody's going to come back and want to see the data that you had, and they're going to compare your effect size to studies of similar ilk to see if this particular context, this particular thread or question of research is actually meaningful. Statistical significance is the probability that the observed difference between the two groups is due to chance. In other words, is it just chance that there's a difference here, or is it that something really is going on here? If the p-value is larger than the alpha level chosen, oftentimes in education 0.05, sometimes if you're really being tight, 0.01, any observed difference is assumed to be explained by the sampling variability. In other words, the variability in the sample might explain the change, but if it's less than that, it's probably you are seeing something maybe going on from your intervention. So statistical significance is the probability that things are not just happening due to chance, that things are really happening because of a particular intervention. With a sufficiently large sample, a statistical test will almost always demonstrate a significant difference, as I mentioned. Then there may be no real effect whatsoever. That is, that the effect size is exactly 0. It's very small. And even if it is significant, they're often meaningless. In other words, moving a needle 1 point on a 10-point scale or even 1 point on a 5-point scale may not be enough value to merit a change. And then thus reporting only the significant p-value for an analysis is not adequate for readers to fully understand the results. So when you're conducting educational research and when you're reading a study, you really want to look for the effect size, because that'll help you with the interpretation of the results, and it should be part of the results section and then discussed later on in the discussion or the conclusion of the article. A little bit more on effect size. And again, we will probably review these exact same slides because this concept is probably new to you and it takes a while to sink in. I'll find more examples such as the one I just mentioned. Yes, it's statistically significant, but is it enough to make us change? The simple definition of an effect size is the magnitude or size of an effect. Statistical significance, e.g. the p is less than 0.05, that means it's probably not due to chance, tells us that there was a difference between the two groups or more based on the treatment or the sorting variable that we are looking at. Some sort of intervention that we had. This expresses the meaning difference between the two groups in the standard deviation units. Typically, you'll see this reported as Cohen's d or simply referred to as d. So Cohen's d is the calculation we often use in education. There are a couple of others, but Cohen's d is typically used to calculate the effect size. So when you read in the article, we use Cohen's d to calculate the effect size. Then that's just a very simple formula, and your text actually discusses it in a little more detail. And again, when we come back to chapter 8, we'll talk about it. The standard interpretation offered by Cohen. Now, this is the important part, and they leave it out of this chapter. I know they're going to come back to it, but they introduce it and kind of leave you hanging. So how do I know what is good or bad? If you have in the calculation a 0.8 or larger after you run Cohen's d in the math, and you plug in the statistical significance figures, and you have a 0.8, that would be considered a fairly large effect size, meaning whatever's going on is a pretty big effect, okay? If you have a 0.5, between 0.5 and 0.8, you have a moderate effect. And you might say, well, moderate effect, yeah, that's worth $1 million, or no, that's only worth $500,000. So that's where the judgment and the interpretation comes in, but that's the calculation. And then finally, if you have a 0.2, that would be considered a small effect. And you might say, well, we're having an effect, something's going on here, it's statistically significant, it has some practical significance, but it's very small, and we don't think it's worth the cost. That is the most important part to take away about understanding about effect sizes, is this little chart right here. And that's pretty standard. I've seen some people move these around a little bit, but this is pretty standard for effect sizes. You also are introduced in this chapter to percentile comparisons, which I think they're really jumping the gun here. Let's wait till we get to chapter 8. But they talk about the various percentile rank, how you would interpret these numbers in terms of percentile rank. And quite honestly, if you're looking at an intervention, that would not be an appropriate way to discuss effect sizes. It would only be appropriate if we were looking at ranks within a certain exam among students individually. So it just depends on the type of work you're looking at. But this to me is the more important takeaway. And this is what I see very often quoted and discussed in educational books and publications that are at the professional level that I've already talked about. So more on that in week 8. A couple of works that you're probably familiar with where you've seen effect size that your district has used to shape and mold policies. In fact, in the Davis District in the early 2000s, this book was called the Bible. Classroom Instruction That Works, Marzano, Pickering, and Pollock. And essentially, a meta-analysis involves translating the statistical results from a set of research studies on the same problem, they all were investigating the same problem, into a statistic called effect size, and then they look at the effect size for that particular problem. This book and most of the Marzano, Pickering, Pollock publications, mostly Marzano, are meta-analyses of things that you've heard about or looked at in education that they think there's been enough research and they've calculated the effect sizes to give you some understanding of what that may be. And I want to spend more time on this, I believe it's in chapter 9, on meta-analyses, but I want to give you just a taste of that. So we'll look at one of the charts in here because I think you've probably seen them or you're probably at least familiar. In fact, we'll look at page 7 of this particular publication, Classroom Instruction That Works. That was done in 2001, followed up by What Works in Schools. Again, calculating effect sizes, looking at effect sizes from various studies, conducting a meta-analysis, putting all of the studies together to make a decision about if a practice was really working or if policies are really working and so on. The other book that he wrote, and there's quite a few others, but these are the ones that I've seen with effect sizes in them. Classroom Assessment and Grading That Works. That's the text that you might be familiar with on some standardized grading and what kinds of achievement levels and so forth that districts have used. So Marzano is quite well published, and in the early 2000s we were just seeing tons and tons and tons of meta-analyses because, quite honestly, education then had about 50 years of research that they could do these kinds of studies and put them together. Chapter briefly talks about meta-analyses. Again, they have one vignette at the end of chapter 3. But I want to look more at search engines now because we do circle back to meta-analyses later. All right, search engines use keywords. This is not rocket science. You have used this already. I'm quite certain as a professional and as a consumer, you have used Google, you've used it on your smartphone, you've used it in your home, you've helped students in class, so on and so forth. So search engines function with keywords. They give you some examples. They talk about how to use quotes around words you definitely want to keep together and then putting the word and then quotes again. If this is new to you, you need to probably read a little bit more detail in that chapter and maybe then do some self-directed learning about how to conduct effective searches. But I felt like this was a part that probably most of you know about, if not, do some self-directed learning. The other thing I want to talk about here are the S's. Sometimes when we are doing searches, we will add an S to make it plural. And if we add the S, sometimes articles don't come up. So be conscious of that when you're searching. For example, I might be searching for, in my case, I search for things online, lesson plans, a lesson plan on apples. And if I put how do apples grow instead of apple and growth, I may or may not get as many things returned back to me. So be conscious about how you're using S. And if you ever wonder, I wonder if I got enough, take the S's off. You know, sometimes you really feel like you need it because you need something plural, but you could try taking it off to see if you're able to get something else that you're really hunting for. Google Scholar captures what it deems scholarly from open and free databases. Your chapter barely, to me, does not discuss sufficiently Google Scholar. It kind of mentions it at the end of the chapter, but Google Scholar is the first place to go when looking for research articles, not some of the other ones they plugged in. Why? And by the way, this book was just published this year, so I'm really surprised that they didn't do a little bit more homework to find out what Google Scholar can really do. And it just gets smarter and smarter about how it gathers data. But essentially there's Google and there's Google Scholar. Google goes and searches everything inside the web. Google Scholar has some algorithms written to find everything that's scholarly, that it deems scholarly content from open and free databases. And they've written some algorithms that says if it's an educational research type database, grab it and put it here. You will not find those kinds of articles inside of just Google because most people are just looking for some sort of web reference. They're not looking for a scholarly reference. So I'm gonna demonstrate that to you in just a moment. USU Library Resources. These resources, again, you pay for them. Oftentimes, if Google Scholar finds it for free, it may also it searches free databases, but the content inside the database may not be free. And so you take a look at that and you're saying, well, I really want to look at that article, but it is $100. No, it's not. You can use the USU Library resources, go through that portal and get access to that article. So sometimes this is the place to start. It's casting your net very wide and then using the USU Library resources to refine your search. They discuss the National Center for Educational Statistics, which if you're looking just for a number, like you're like, what is the percentage of? How many students do? This is a place where they just gather that kind of descriptive data through doing different research with school districts nationally and state offices of education nationally. So this is a good site when you're looking for just a specific captured demographic or statistic. They also on this site house the What Works Clearinghouse. And actually, when I taught this course a few years ago, it was when I was first exposed to this particular website. And we'll take a quick look at it. But what I liked about it is that they not only have some of the more current research, but when you look at their website, they talk about, they have it critiqued. And they critique what was good or bad or how valid they felt the research was. And it gives you some indication as a novice or even a person who's like just searching, is this something, is this obvious in this study that I didn't have a good sampling or a good population? Man, I just want to discount that. So it gives you some idea from professional critiquers about whether the study was valid, whether it was decent or good enough that you may want to look at it. So I really like that about this particular, of course, you're going through their interpretation, but they use a pretty tight rubric that you can also take a look at to see whether or not, how they would evaluate research. So that is something your text mentions, and I do think it is a good resource. ERIC, the Educational Research Information Clearinghouse, and maybe you've heard of this previously or seen articles because it is a free government-funded. That doesn't always mean that the articles inside, like Scholar, are going to be free. It just means that it's a free database, and the articles within there that it's using to search with may in fact be, you have to pay for it, or if you go behind and into the USU Library and log in with your credentials, it's quite possible that USU Library pays for a subscription, and because it pays for a subscription, you have access to those resources. So that's a little bit about the search engines. This is the last part now of Chapter 4. And I'm going to demonstrate the search engines, but I want to get this last slide out of the way, this last piece of content. Citation managers. They talk briefly about citation managers. And in fact, I think I had a large section on this here, and I've just cut it and pushed it down into week 9 because it is really its own animal, but it's real important for you to understand how to store and retrieve the data that you're trying to, or the studies that you want to cite later. They mention it here, citation storage. A lot of these search engines, including Scholar, including ERIC, have a way for you to store things that you like. Once you find them, you say, save this, you create a profile, and you can retrieve that data later. They also have some ways to integrate citation storage with your word processing. So as you're typing along and you want to cite a study, some of them have ways for you to access that date or the authors, put it in there, and then it tracks to the end. When you do your references, it'll make a note that, you used this study from 2011, and it will automatically populate it into your references. That can save you a ton of time, especially if you've made sure that the citation went in accurately into the database that is storing that information. It's beyond what I want to do this week because it's just a lot more content. So I'm going to hold and I'm going to save that. I just made a note to week 9. We're going to talk about Zotero and those things. But there are some possibilities here with using Word and just using the reference tab. It doesn't auto-populate the information at the end. That's something that I think is a little cumbersome, and I think there are better, but some people like to use it. And then there's others that we're going to take a look at on the Wikipedia page where your text actually suggests to go there because there's a nice comparison of this type of management software. Again, we'll look at this in a little bit more detail later. Just a small word here about Wikipedia. Lots of folks in research, if they see citations from Wikipedia, they completely diss them and say that, that it's not valid because anybody can put anything up they want with Wikipedia. I can't even remember what the statistic is on how many people use Wikipedia every day or every hour, but it would blow your mind. And my feeling about Wikipedia is that it's a good place to start. If you search something and it comes up with at least a definition, you can go to it, and if it's a decent article on Wikipedia, they will have their references cited at the bottom. They have them footnoted so you can go back to a secondary or a primary resource on that content. So I think Wikipedia is a good place to start. I think it's a good place to be skeptical, and then just dig a little bit further. So if you have in your paper a citation from Wikipedia, it would maybe be a definition. I wouldn't use it a lot, and it would be better for you to do it as part of your research, as kind of casting a broad net, but focus in on the resources that are noted at the end of the Wikipedia pages. So I'm not totally averse to it, but I say use it with caution. And also, if you put one or two as in part of your citations, it's probably okay, unless it's something very controversial, because especially if it's something on charter schools and it's almost political, then you've got to question the content inside of Wikipedia, and you should definitely go to the primary or at least a better secondary resource. All right, more on that in chapter 9. Now, let's get back here to, I'm going to bring up a couple of searching tools. So we talked a little bit here about Google Scholar, and let's, I Googled a few things here, charter schools and achievement. Cyberbullying is another one. The article Teaching to the Test, I asked you to look at that in the discussion. But if we take a look at, well, let's see charter schools. Or actually, let's try homework, because that's also at the end. Let's just say homework. That is a lot to say. Maybe we should add effectiveness and see what we get. So again, this is Google Scholar, scholar.google.com, and here we have computer homework effectiveness and developmental mathematics, online homework effectiveness, multicultural psychotherapy, synthesis of research on homework. What year? 1989. And it's like, maybe that is something that would be useful to me. Maybe I can take a look at that. Notice also up here that I am signed in with my USU credentials, and you should watch that in the other video so you have access to some other things. Also notice that over here on the right side, if it's a free resource that Scholar has grabbed, that they'll put it here. And you can click on this and get the entire PDF. If you don't see anything here, it means that they didn't really have access to that particular file. Now this one actually, ASCD Asia.pdf is one. It's a educational leadership guide. Actually, let's take a look. I want to look at the citation for this one. And it gives me the different formats, and we are always APA, Synthesis of Research on Homework, Educational Leadership, which I happen to know is a magazine, so it's going to be a professional, it's not a journal article. And it was from 1989. Okay, if I close that, it says that it's available publicly, so I click here, and hopefully it's scanned in, so it's fairly old. But when it's the newer ones, it's easier. Just this one, you can select text, but you can. It's usually more of a, not seeing all of the faded kind of pages here. It's cleaner. That's the word I'm looking for. So here's does homework work? It's a professional lit review. It's one that is written for a practitioner, and it may be one that some of you want to take a look at for the question I ask you, or for evaluating that particular question in the reading this week. So that's an article that you can get and grab easily from Google Scholar. Now, one thing, I had to hit the back button to come here. Sometimes I want to just open a whole bunch of these, but I don't want to lose this page. So I would recommend that you right-click and open a new tab. And you might not be able to see it's off your screen a little bit, but open a new tab so that you don't kind of lose the place that you're located in. I mean, you can rerun the search and you can save the searches that you have in here. But that's what I would recommend is taking, opening up, and it opened it right here for me in a new tab. Okay. So here's quite a bit, effectiveness of web-based homework. And so now I might have to go back up here and define the type of homework, or I might want to say elementary students, or I might want to say high school students, or I might want to say homework effectiveness, how much homework, you know, how much homework is effective. And now I'm talking about time. And answers throughout research practical questions about homework. What makes schools effective? So I don't need to go through all these. I just want to show you how Google Scholar works. A couple of other things here. When you have the save button, if you are logged in like I am, you will be able to save it, that particular study, to a location. Now it says saved. And in fact, I need to kind of go here to Scholar. Oops. And my screen is so small. Here we are. I actually needed to just go right up here. My citations, well, not my citations, sorry, should be my library. And here are some articles that I put in last night when I was looking at, in this case on achievement, I was looking at charter schools. That's why you saw the charter school search. But the item on homework that I just barely looked at is now inside of this little library. And you can also, if you go through Google Scholar and you want to use it to categorize things, you can also set up your own little different folders to put these items into and move them around so that you have them on the right concepts. So that's a little bit about Google Scholar. And I'm actually going to enlarge this because it seems like, there we go. Now, some of it went off the screen, but when I'm in that small mode, it's hard for you to see over here that I actually created a little library, one for charter schools, and I moved the articles into this. It's pretty self-explanatory. You're going to create labels, and you're going to create the new label here, and then you're going to when you manage that label, you'll say what it is that you want to do. You want to add that article to it. So if I add a new label and I called it homework, create. And by the way, to me, this wasn't that intuitive. Edit, whoops, cancel. I click on homework, and now I have to, like, where are the articles for this label? Well, you say, I've got some in my library that were just added there. I need to move this particular article, and I'm going to move it. I'm going to move it by clicking on the title, and then I've got to say, okay, I want to put it with a label. I'm going to add it to homework, add homework. And now when I go back to my particular library and I look at homework, I should see it there. There it is. So that's a little bit about how you manage and categorize some of the things that you find in Google Scholar.